In 2003, Safeway was the fourth largest supermarket chain in Britain. Not struggling, not failing. Still opening new stores, still turning a profit, still trusted by millions of British families every single week, just as it had been for over 40 years. Within 2 years, every one of its stores would carry someone else's name. Picture the red S above the door, the beep of the self-scan gun in your hand. Technology no other British supermarket dared offer first. The ABC loyalty card tucked into your mother's purse. The smell of bread baked fresh that morning. And the play area where you left the children while you filled the trolley. For 4 decades, Safeway was simply where Britons shopped. Then, in under 2 years, the shelves emptied, the signs came down, and the name disappeared from every high street in the country. So how does a supermarket that was not dying, one still winning customers, still growing, simply cease to exist? This is the story of how Britain's fourth largest grocer vanished, not through failure, but through a takeover battle nobody saw coming. Safeway did not begin with a single visionary standing in an empty shop, dreaming of what it might become. It began with a decision made an ocean away. In 1962, the American grocery giant Safeway Inc., already one of the largest supermarket operators in the United States, looked across the Atlantic and saw an opportunity. Britain's food shopping still belonged largely to a different era. Small grocers, counter service, a shop assistant fetching each item while the customer waited and asked. America had already moved on. Wide aisles, open shelves, self-service, refrigerated cabinets stocked with more choice than most British shoppers had ever seen in one place. Safeway Inc. believed Britain was ready for that same transformation, and it was willing to bet real money on the idea. The company did not build from nothing. It bought its way in, acquiring a handful of existing London grocery businesses, John Gardner's supermarkets and Prideaux's, bringing somewhere between 7 and 11 shops under a new banner, Safeway Food Stores Limited. These were modest beginnings by later standards, scattered across Greater London, but each one was reworked to carry the new philosophy. Shelves were widened, deli counters were added, offering cured meats and cheeses arranged for the customer to see and choose, not simply a request. The layout itself was the argument. Shopping should feel like discovery, not a transaction conducted through a counter. The true statement of intent came a year later, in 1963, when Safeway opened its first purpose-built store in Bedford. This was not a converted grocer's shop wearing a new sign. It was designed from the ground up around the American model. Long aisles bathed in bright overhead lighting, a delicatessen counter as a centerpiece rather than an afterthought, and shelving stacked high with a range of tinned goods, fresh produce, and household items that dwarfed what a typical British corner shop could offer. For shoppers walking through the doors that year, the experience was unlike anything they had known. There was no queue at a counter, no list handed to an assistant behind glass. There was simply choice, laid out and waiting to be picked up by hand. The belief driving all of this was simple, even if it was never written down as a company slogan, that British families deserved the same abundance, the same convenience, and the same dignity of choice that American shoppers already took for granted. Safeway was not merely selling groceries, it was selling a new way of moving through a shop, of standing in front of a shelf and deciding for oneself, rather than being served across a divide. It was a quiet kind of revolution, dressed in bright lighting and wide aisles rather than slogans or spectacle. Few of the shoppers who wandered into that first purpose-built Bedford store in 1963 could have known they were witnessing the opening chapter of a story that would run for more than 4 decades, one that would eventually make Safeway a fixture of British life, long before anyone could imagine it disappearing entirely. What began as an experiment imported from America was about to become something far bigger, not just a shop, but a habit woven into the rhythm of British family life. By the mid-1980s, Safeway had stopped being an American import and become something else entirely, a fixture of ordinary British life. The peak stretched across roughly 2 decades, from the mid-1980s through to the turn of the millennium, years in which a trip to Safeway was less an errand than a small, dependable ritual that shaped the rhythm of the week. Saturday morning belonged to Safeway for millions of families. The trolley pulled from the row outside, the pound coin slotted into the handle, the walk through automatic doors that still, for older shoppers, carried a faint trace of novelty even after 20 years. What made the ritual matter was not simply that the shop was convenient. It was that going to Safeway meant something specific depending on who you were. For a mother with two young children in the early 1990s, it meant a trolley with a fold-down seat, a play area near the entrance where a child could be left for 10 safe minutes while the weekly shop was finished, and a member of staff behind the deli counter who knew her by the shape of her usual order. A quarter of ham, off the bone, cut thin. For a pensioner on a fixed income, it meant a loyalty card. Introduced in 1995 under the name Added Bonus Card, the first such scheme any major British supermarket had offered, turning a routine purchase into something that quietly paid the shopper back. For a teenager sent out on a Friday evening errand, it meant the hum and beep of the self-scan handset, clipped into its cradle by the trolley bay, a piece of technology no other British supermarket had yet dared to offer to ordinary customers, and one that made an unremarkable chore feel, briefly, like something out of the future. That self-scan system, trialed from April 1995 and expanded to roughly 150 stores by 1998, was more than a gadget. It was proof, repeated in shop after shop across the country, that Safeway was a step ahead of its rivals. That when new technology reached British retail, it seemed to arrive at Safeway first. Customers who had grown used to queuing behind a till operator now found themselves scanning their own shopping as they walked, printing their own receipt, and leaving with the quiet, small satisfaction of having done something slightly modern. Tesco and Sainsbury's would follow eventually. But for those first years, the self-scan gun belonged to Safeway alone, and shoppers knew it. The mid-1990s brought a further transformation. One felt less in gadgets than in the shape of the shop itself. Stores were rebuilt wider, brighter, more deliberately designed around the shopping mother rather than the working man popping in for essentials on his way home. Aisles widened to let two trolleys pass without a squeeze. Play areas appeared near the entrances. The deli counters grew longer, the fresh produce sections more generous. The whole experience engineered to make navigating a large superstore feel less like an obstacle course and more like an outing. Some of the largest new stores opened at a rate of 20 to 25 a year through the early 1990s, stretched to nearly 30,000 square feet. Vast, by the standards of a shopper who could still remember the corner grocer with its single narrow aisle. It was not only the customer's experience that defined these years. For the people who worked the tills, stacked the shelves, or ran the deli counter, Safeway in its prime offered something increasingly rare on the high street, a steady job with a recognizable uniform, in a shop that seemed at the time to be going nowhere but upward. Staff who had joined in the 1970s found themselves by the 1990s training a new generation of till operators on machines that hadn't existed when they started. There was a quiet pride in that continuity, in being part of a shop that families returned to across 3 generations, a grandmother's habit passed down to a mother, passed down again to a daughter pushing her own trolley 2 decades later. And yet, was there a moment walking those wide, well-lit aisles in 1996 or 1997 when any shopper could have imagined those same stores wearing a different name within a decade? Almost certainly not. Safeway in those years felt permanent, as fixed a part of the British high street as the post office or the bank. But permanence in retail is rarely more than a temporary illusion. Even as the self-scan guns beeped and the loyalty cards were swiped, the first quiet signs of trouble were already beginning to surface in boardrooms far from the shop floor. Signs that no customer standing at the deli counter could yet see. The engine behind Safeway's growth did not begin with the American parent company at all. It began in 1987 when Safeway Inc. sold its British operation entirely to the Argyle Group, a British conglomerate already running a patchwork of grocery brands under different names. Presto, Low Cost, and others acquired through years of piecemeal deal-making. At the time of the sale, Safeway UK stood at around 130 shops, a respectable but hardly dominant presence on the British high street. Argyle's decision was not simply to keep Safeway running as it was. It chose to make Safeway the banner under which its entire grocery empire would eventually march. What followed was less an organic bloom and more a deliberate act of consolidation. Argyle began converting its larger Presto supermarkets into Safeway stores, one by one, absorbing a rival brand's shop fronts and repainting them in red. The smaller Presto shops, concentrated in northeast England and Scotland, were allowed to continue for a time under their own name, even enjoying a brief revival in the early 1990s, with new openings and a fresh own-label range. But the writing was on the wall. The last new Presto shop opened in 1995. By then, Safeway was clearly the future Argyle had chosen, and Presto the past it was quietly retiring. This was expansion by acquisition and rebranding, rather than by building from scratch, and it changed the character of growth itself. Where the 1960s and 1970s had been about proving a new shopping experience worked at all, the 1980s and 1990s were about scale, about turning a regional grocery operator into a genuine national force capable of standing alongside Tesco, Sainsbury's, and the newly aggressive Asda. Argyle poured serious capital into the project. In 1991 alone, the company opened 18 new superstores, totaling over 500,000 square feet of retail space, with plans to keep opening 20 to 25 more every year through the decade. Each new superstore averaged around 28,000 square feet, large enough to support the fresh food counters, wider aisles, and non-food ranges that had become central to the Safeway identity. The physical footprint spread accordingly. What had started as a cluster of London shops in 1962 became, by the mid-1990s, a genuinely national chain. Stores stretching from the south coast of England up through the Midlands into Scotland, and eventually as far north as the Highlands. By 1999, Safeway had even built a dedicated rail supply chain, running container trains as far as Inverness, Nairn, Elgin, and Buckey, simply to keep remote Scottish stores stocked. A supermarket that had begun as an experiment for London shoppers was now feeding towns most of its founders would never have imagined reaching. Growth on this scale reshaped what it meant to work for Safeway. For a new generation of employees, joining the company in the late 1980s or early 1990s meant genuine opportunity. A till operator promoted to deli supervisor, a shelf stacker trained up to manage a new superstore opening in a town that had never had one before. Every new store meant new jobs, new management positions, new careers that hadn't existed a decade earlier. But rapid expansion carried its own quiet pressure. Store managers were expected to hit opening targets on tight timelines. Head office demanded consistency across hundreds of locations that were, in truth, a patchwork of former Presto shops, former independent grocers, and purpose-built superstores, each with its own history, its own layout quirks, its own local staff culture, now expected to fall in line behind a single red banner. By 1996, that consolidation reached its natural conclusion. Argyle Group, the parent company that had spent nearly a decade absorbing rival chains under the Safeway name, formally renamed itself Safeway plc. The subsidiary had become so central to the business that it swallowed the name of its own parent. It was, in its way, the final proof of how completely the expansion strategy had succeeded. What had begun in 1987 as a British conglomerate buying an American supermarket's cast-off UK arm was now, by name and by identity, simply Safeway, and Safeway alone. The company Argyle had built by 1996 bore little resemblance to the modest 130-shop operation it had purchased 9 years earlier. It was larger, more disciplined, technologically ahead of its rivals, and carried a national reputation few could rival. But scale, however impressive, is not the same as security. Somewhere beneath the steady drumbeat of new store openings and rebranded shop fronts, the seeds of a very different kind of story were already being planted, one that would not become visible to ordinary shoppers for several more years. By 2002, the transformation was complete. Safeway was no longer simply a successful grocery chain. It was the fourth largest supermarket operator in the entire United Kingdom, a genuine national institution standing shoulder to shoulder with Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Asda in the minds of British shoppers. The red S above the door had become as familiar a piece of the British high street as a post box or a pub sign. This was the moment the brand reached its true cultural saturation, not merely a place to buy food, but a fixed point in the national landscape, one that entire families had grown up around without ever pausing to notice how completely it had woven itself into ordinary life. The 479 stores that would eventually make up the chain by the time of its takeover in 2004 were the physical proof of that reach, stretching from London to the Scottish Highlands, from Wales to Northern Ireland. But the deeper measure of Safeway's peak was not in the store count. It was in the way three generations of the same family might, without ever discussing it, all shop at the same chain. A grandmother who remembered the excitement of that first wide-aisle shop in the 1960s. A mother who had raised her own children on Saturday morning trips with a trolley seat and a play area nearby. And a teenager sent out with a 5-pound note and instructions, scanning items himself with a handset that still felt faintly futuristic even a few years after its introduction. Nobody planned this generational handover. It simply happened, the way habits do, quietly and without ceremony, until an entire country had grown up alongside a single supermarket chain. The press in these years treated Safeway not as an ordinary retailer, but as an innovator worth watching. Its self-scan technology, introduced years ahead of any rival, had made it a repeated subject of coverage in the trade press and beyond. Proof, printed again and again, that when new ideas arrived in British retail, they tended to arrive at Safeway first. That reputation mattered. It gave ordinary shoppers something to feel faintly proud of, a sense that their weekly shop was, in some small way, at the front of things rather than trailing behind. For the people who worked inside those 479 stores, being part of Safeway at its height carried its own quiet satisfaction. A till supervisor in 2002 might have joined the company as a teenager in the 1980s, watched the shop she worked in rebuilt twice over, trained newer staff on self-scan machines that hadn't existed when she started, and risen, gradually, into management. Her whole working life traced through the walls of a single, ever-expanding company. For thousands of employees across the country, Safeway was not simply a job. It was a career that had grown up alongside them, store by store, decade by decade, and Safeway's roots ran deeper than the shop floor. In towns across Britain, a Safeway superstore was often one of the largest employers on the high street, a sponsor of local school fetes and community events, a fixture so embedded in civic life that its presence was simply assumed. The way a town assumes its own church or town hall will always be there. It is worth pausing here, before the story turns dark, to sit with what that meant. This was not a company on the margins of British life, quietly fading. This was a company at the absolute center of it, trusted, familiar, and by every visible measure, thriving. What, then, does it mean for something so completely woven into the fabric of ordinary life to vanish so suddenly that an entire country barely has time to say goodbye? That is the question this story is building toward. But not yet, because behind the confident press coverage and the record store count of 2002, behind the crowded car parks and the loyalty cards swiped by the thousand, something else was already stirring. Safeway's own financial performance had begun, almost imperceptibly, to falter. Its shares had underperformed for years, and in boardrooms far removed from the deli counters and the self-scan machines, quiet, uneasy conversations about the company's future had already begun. The trouble began, as it so often does, not with a single dramatic failure, but with a set of numbers that meant little to the ordinary shopper and a great deal to the people who studied them closely. For the year ending April 1994, Safeway's pre-tax profits fell by 13%, a figure that barely registered outside the financial press, but one that landed hard inside the company's head office. 13% was not a catastrophe. It was, however, a warning that something in the model built so carefully over the previous decade had begun to strain. The response was swift and, in hindsight, telling. Chief Executive Colin Smith launched a sweeping strategic review that came to be known internally as Safeway 2000, bringing in the consulting firm McKinsey to help chart a way forward. It was the kind of move a confident, growing company rarely needs to make. A signal, however quiet, that the assumptions underpinning years of expansion were being questioned at the very top. As part of that review, Safeway sold off its low-cost chain entirely to the cooperative retail services, narrowing its focus, and began redesigning its remaining stores to better appeal to the family shopper. The wider aisles, the play areas, the softened layouts that shoppers would come to associate with mid-1990s Safeway. These changes were sold to customers as improvements, and in many ways they were. But they were also unmistakably a company adjusting course because the old course had stopped working as well as it once had. By early 1999, the unease had spread beyond the boardroom and into the financial pages. Safeway's shares had underperformed the rest of the food retail sector for 5 consecutive years, an uncomfortable, sustained pattern that investors do not forgive quietly. The company had been pushed back into fourth position in the UK grocery market, overtaken by the increasingly aggressive Asda, a chain that had spent the decade expanding with a ruthlessness Safeway had not matched. Perhaps more damaging still, Safeway simply did not have enough large-format stores to build out a comprehensive non-food range. The clothing, homeware, and electrical sections that were becoming an increasingly important source of profit for its rivals. Tesco and Asda were becoming, in effect, department stores that happened to sell groceries. Safeway, constrained by the size and location of many of its shops, could not follow. None of this was visible to the shopper pushing a trolley through the aisles in 1999. To them, Safeway looked exactly as it always had. The same red signage, the same self-scan guns, the same deli counter staff who knew their usual order. This is the quiet cruelty of decline inside a large retail company. The shop floor is almost always the last place to feel it. A woman doing her weekly shop in a Safeway superstore in the Midlands that year had no reason to suspect that, in London boardrooms, analysts were quietly downgrading the company's prospects, and that senior executives were beginning to ask themselves an uncomfortable question: whether Safeway on its own could survive the coming decade at all. For those working inside the company, the picture was harder to ignore. Store managers were told to hold costs steady, even as rivals invested more aggressively in refurbishment. Head office reorganizations became more frequent, each one accompanied by the low hum of uncertainty that spreads through any large workforce when a company begins, visibly, to search for answers rather than simply execute a plan. Some longtime employees, people who had joined in the confident expansion years of the 1980s, began to sense, even if they could not have named it precisely, that something had shifted. The company was no longer simply building, it was defending. How long, realistically, can a business stay near the top of its industry once its own investors have lost patience and its rivals have found a format it cannot easily copy? That was the question Safeway's leadership was quietly wrestling with as the 20th century drew to a close. And it was a question that would not remain confined to boardrooms and shareholder reports for very much longer. Within a few short years, the answer would arrive not as a slow fade, but as a sudden, very public battle for the company's survival. One that would begin with an offer nobody in the industry saw coming. On the morning of 9th January 2003, Safeway's board received an offer that, on paper, should have seemed almost implausible. WEM Morrison Supermarkets, a regional chain with roughly 119 stores, concentrated almost entirely in the north of England, a fraction of Safeway's size and national reach, proposed to buy the company outright. The terms were straightforward: 1.32 new Morrison shares for every Safeway share, an all-share offer valued at close to £2.9 billion. It was, by any ordinary measure of the industry, a smaller company reaching up to swallow a much larger one. And crucially, it came with the cooperation of Safeway's own board, who saw in Morrison's a partner rather than a predator. That cooperation did not last long as the only offer on the table. News of the Morrisons' approach acted less like a single announcement and more like a starting gun. Within days, some of the largest names in British and international retail signaled that they, too, were considering bids of their own. Tesco confirmed it was weighing a move by 21 January. Sainsbury's followed. Asda, by then owned by the American giant Walmart, let it be known it might enter the fray as well. Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, the private equity firm that had helped finance Safeway's original sale to Argyle back in 1987, resurfaced as a potential bidder, a strange kind of homecoming for a company circling an asset it had once helped shape. And Philip Green, the retail magnate already known for his ownership of BHS in Arcadia, entered through a vehicle called Track Dean Investments, adding a further layer of uncertainty to who, exactly, might end up owning one of Britain's most familiar supermarket names. What had begun as a modest takeover proposal from a regional northern chain had, in a matter of weeks, become the largest and most closely watched bidding war in the history of British food retail. For a company that had spent 4 decades building trust through consistency, the same red signage, the same loyalty scheme, the same deli counter routines repeated store after store, the sudden spectacle of 5 or 6 of the country's most powerful retail players circling it like this was a strange and unsettling kind of tribute. Safeway had become, almost overnight, the most valuable prize in British grocery, precisely at the moment its own board had quietly concluded it could no longer stand entirely on its own. The government did not stand by and watch. On 21st of January 2003, the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Patricia Hewitt, referred the Morrisons' proposal to the Competition Commission, and in doing so, effectively froze every rival bid until the review concluded. For the industry, this transformed a fast-moving auction into a prolonged, tense waiting game, playing out across many months, with regulators scrutinizing what a merger between any of Britain's largest grocers might mean for competition, pricing, in the thousands of towns where a Safeway or a rival chain stood as the only large supermarket for miles. Inside Safeway itself, this period must have felt like living inside a story being written by other people. Employees who had spent years, sometimes decades, working the tills, running the deli counters, managing the stockrooms of a company they understood intimately, now found themselves reading newspaper speculation to learn what their own future might hold. A shop floor supervisor in Yorkshire or a checkout manager in Cardiff had no more insight into which of these 5 circling companies would eventually own their branch than any customer walking in for a pint of milk. The decision, when it came, would be made in boardrooms and regulatory hearing rooms hundreds of miles from any actual shop, and it would be final regardless of what any individual employee hoped for. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in being the prize in someone else's contest, rather than the author of your own future. Safeway's board, in agreeing to cooperate with Morrisons back in January, had effectively accepted that the company's 4-decade independent story was ending, whatever the eventual outcome. The only remaining question was which name would end up above the door, and who in truth was making that decision on behalf of the millions of ordinary shoppers who had built their weekly routines, their loyalty card habits, their children's Saturday mornings, around the assumption that Safeway would simply always be there? The regulatory review dragged through much of 2003, a slow unraveling of certainty that no press release could fully capture. For the employees living through it, each month of silence carried its own quiet cost. The postponed decisions, the unspoken worry about pensions and positions, the strange experience of coming to work every day at a company whose ownership was, quite literally, still being decided by people they would never meet. And for the millions of customers who had no idea any of this was happening, the shop looked exactly the same as it always had. The same red signage, the same self-scan machines, the same deli counter, the same ordinary Saturday morning. They had no way of knowing that behind that unchanged shop front, the countdown to a very different kind of ending had already begun. The waiting ended in March 2004. After more than a year of scrutiny, the Competition Commission cleared the deal, subject to Morrisons selling off a number of stores in areas where the merger would leave too little competition. On the 8th of March 2004, Morrisons formally completed its acquisition of Safeway PLC. The company that had begun as a small, ambitious northern chain of just over 100 stores had, in one stroke, become the 4th largest supermarket group in Britain, the very position Safeway itself had held for years. It was less a merger of equals than a complete absorption, and everyone involved understood it that way from the start. What followed was not a quiet transition, but a methodical dismantling, carried out at a pace that startled even those who had expected it. Rather than attempt to run two national supermarket brands side by side, Morrisons chose full conversion. Every viable Safeway store would eventually be repainted, restocked, and reopened under the Morrisons name. The process began almost immediately and accelerated once early results revealed the true scale of losses building up within the newly acquired Safeway estate. Losses that had not been fully visible to outsiders during the long months of regulatory review. What had looked from a distance like a healthy fourth-place supermarket chain now revealed weaker foundations than the bidding war of 2003 had suggested. The conversion did not simply mean a change of signage. It meant a wholesale reallocation of an entire estate built up over 4 decades. Morrisons had no history in the convenience store sector, unlike Tesco, Sainsbury's, or the Co-op, and made a clear, strategic choice not to enter it. As a result, in October 2004, the 114 smaller Safeway compact shops, the local high street-sized stores that many customers had relied on for a quick evening shop rather than a full weekly one, were sold off entirely to a rival, Summerfield, in a deal worth just over £260 million. These were not empty buildings changing hands. They were shops with staff who had worked under the Safeway name for years, now told they would be working for a company that had, until recently, been a competitor. Elsewhere, the estate was carved up piece by piece, according to where each store made most strategic sense. In Northern Ireland, where Morrisons had little interest in operating, former Safeway branches were sold on to Asda, including one store in Bangor that, in a small irony of timing, only opened its doors for the first time after the Morrisons takeover had already been completed, briefly trading as a brand that no longer independently existed. In England, some of the largest and most desirable sites went to an entirely different kind of buyer. In August 2005, Waitrose purchased 5 former Safeway shops in a single transaction, and a further 6 were acquired the following month, including a store in Hexham, Northumberland, that became, however briefly, the most northerly Waitrose branch in the country. A joint venture petrol station arrangement Safeway had run for years with BP was quietly terminated by Morrisons that same year, one more small thread of the old company being cut. For the tens of thousands of people who worked inside Safeway stores, the collapse did not arrive as a single dramatic headline. It arrived, store by store, as a private announcement delivered to a specific team on a specific morning. Sometimes good news in the sense that the branch would simply become a Morrisons and jobs would largely continue. Sometimes far harder news when a store was earmarked for sale to Summerfield, Asda, or Waitrose, meaning new contracts, new management, new terms, and no guarantee that seniority built up over 15 or 20 years at Safeway would count for anything at all under a different employer's roof. A deli counter supervisor who had trained new starters on the self-scan machines back in 1996 might find herself, less than a decade later, being trained in turn on an entirely different till system under an entirely different company's uniform, in the very same building where she had built her career. For customers, the experience was quieter but no less disorienting. Week by week, the familiar red signage disappeared from one town after another, replaced by Morrisons' own colors and branding. Shoppers who had spent decades navigating the same aisles, using the same self-scan handsets, swiping the same ABC loyalty cards, found themselves instead learning an unfamiliar layout under an unfamiliar name. The physical shop unchanged in many cases, the walls and car park exactly as they remembered, but everything else quietly, irreversibly different. There was no single dramatic closing day for most of these stores. No locked doors or empty shelves in the way an American mall anchor might close for good. Instead, there was something perhaps stranger, a shop that never stopped trading, never stopped serving customers, and yet slowly ceased to be the place it had always been. The final act came on 24th of November 2005, when the last Safeway-branded store in the country completed its conversion to Morrisons. There was no grand farewell, no televised final day, no crowd gathered to mark the moment. The red S that had first appeared over a handful of London shop fronts in 1962 simply stopped appearing anywhere in Britain at all. Quietly, almost without ceremony, 43 years after it had first gone up. What does it mean for a brand that touched three generations of British shoppers to end not in bankruptcy, not in scandal, but in a boardroom decision about market share and store conversion schedules? There is no single satisfying answer. What is certain is only this: something that had quietly shaped the Saturday mornings, the loyalty card habits, and the Christmas shopping trips of millions of ordinary families was, by the end of 2005, simply gone. Replaced, absorbed, and in the eyes of most of the country, already half forgotten. In the years that followed the last conversion, Morrison's found itself transformed by the very deal that had, for a time, seemed almost improbable. The company that had approached Safeway in January 2003 with barely more than 100 stores concentrated in the north of England now stood, virtually overnight, as the fourth largest supermarket group in Britain. The exact position Safeway itself had occupied for years before the takeover began. It was a remarkable inheritance. The customer base, the store estate, the market share, all absorbed into a single competitor that had once been a fraction of Safeway's size. The industry's so-called Big Four, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's, and Morrison's, took the shape in which most British shoppers would come to know it for the following 2 decades. And Safeway's disappearance was the final piece that made that shape possible. The Safeway name did not vanish from Britain entirely, though what remained bore little resemblance to the company that had once operated hundreds of stores nationwide. In November 2016, more than a decade after the last shop front had been repainted, Morrison's revived the Safeway brand. Not as a chain of supermarkets, but as a range of products manufactured in Morrison's own factories and distributed to independent retailers across the country. It was a curious kind of afterlife, a name that had once meant a full weekend shop, a play area for the children, a deli counter, and a self-scan handset, now reduced to a label on packaging, sitting on the shelves of the small independent shops the original Safeway had helped make old-fashioned back in 1962. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered the brand at its height. Then in 2023, Morrison's announced it was phasing out even that limited use of the name, quietly closing the final chapter on a brand identity that had first appeared over London shopfronts 61 years earlier. For the tens of thousands of people who had built careers inside Safeway, the aftermath took many different shapes. Some transitioned smoothly into Morrison's roles, continuing careers that had begun decades earlier, simply under a different uniform and a different set of till systems to learn. Others, particularly those whose stores were sold to Summerfield, Asda, or Waitrose, found themselves starting over in companies with different cultures, different pension arrangements, and no guarantee that years of loyalty and seniority would carry the same weight they once had. And for the communities built around former Safeway superstores, the towns where the shop had been not just a place to buy groceries, but one of the largest local employers and a quiet fixture of civic life, the disappearance of the name left a strange kind of gap that no rebranding exercise could entirely fill, even when the building itself and most of its staff remained exactly where they had always been. The broader lesson of Safeway's disappearance was not one of failure in the way earlier chapters of British retail history had understood the word. Safeway did not go bankrupt. It did not lose its customers through some catastrophic scandal or collapse in quality. It was, by most ordinary measures, still a fundamentally sound business in 2003, profitable, trusted, technologically ahead of much of its competition. What it lacked was scale in an industry that had decided, decisively and irreversibly, that scale was the only currency that mattered. Safeway's fourth-place position, once perfectly respectable, had become a vulnerability the moment three much larger rivals, in a hungry regional challenger, all looked at the same set of numbers and reached the same conclusion: that a company of exactly this size, exactly this trusted, was worth more taken apart and absorbed than left to compete alone. That lesson did not stay confined to the grocery trade. It became, in the years that followed, a recognizable pattern across British high streets more broadly. Familiar, trusted, apparently healthy names disappearing not because customers stopped loving them, but because someone, somewhere, decided they were more valuable as pieces of a larger company than as themselves. Safeway's story is, in that sense, less an isolated tragedy than an early and unusually clean example of something that would keep happening again and again. Two other names British shoppers assumed would simply always be there. What does it mean, then, for a country to keep losing the shops that shaped its childhoods and its Saturday mornings? Not to failure, but to the quiet mathematics of who can grow fastest and by whom. That question did not end with Safeway in 2005, and it has not been answered since. Picture it one last time. A Saturday morning, somewhere in Britain, any year between 1985 and 2003. The trolley pulled loose from the row outside, the pound coin slotted into the handle with a small metallic click, the automatic doors parting with that faint hydraulic sigh. Inside, the particular smell of a Safeway superstore. Bread from the in-store bakery, still warm, laid out near the entrance as if to greet you before anything else could. The low hum of refrigerated cabinets, the beep of the self-scan gun clipped to the trolley handle, ready to be lifted and pointed at the first tin of the week. A child briefly delighted by the play area near the tills, waving before disappearing into it for 10 borrowed minutes. The deli counter where the same assistant, week after week, cut the same quarter of ham off the bone without needing to be asked twice. The ABC loyalty card, pulled from a purse or wallet, swiped without a second thought, the small reward of points accumulating somewhere unseen. None of it felt remarkable at the time. That was precisely the point. A supermarket is not, on its face, the kind of place that ought to matter beyond the groceries it sells. And yet Safeway mattered in ways that had very little to do with what sat on its shelves. It mattered because it gave shape to the week, a fixed point every Saturday morning that a family could organize itself around year after year without ever discussing why. It mattered because it was, for many towns, one of the largest and steadiest employers on the high street, offering not just wages but a kind of quiet continuity. A till operator who became a supervisor who became a manager, an entire working life traced through the walls of a single building. It mattered because it carried technology that made ordinary people feel, briefly and pleasantly, as though the future had arrived a little early. The self-scan gun in 1995, the loyalty card that same year, small conveniences that nonetheless made a routine chore feel like something worth noticing. And it mattered most of all because it was passed down without ceremony from one generation to the next. A grandmother's Saturday habit becoming a mother's, becoming a daughter's, each of them pushing a trolley through aisles that had, in their own way, watched an entire family grow up. Safeway was never simply a place to buy food. It was a small, dependable thread woven through the ordinary texture of British family life, present in the background of 1,000 unremarkable Saturdays that nobody thought to record because nobody imagined they would need to be remembered. Safeway did not fail the people who loved it. It was not undone by poor food, by a scandal, or by customers who stopped coming through its doors. It was undone by the quiet arithmetic of an industry that had decided, somewhere far from any shop floor, that being trusted and profitable was no longer enough on its own. That is worth remembering plainly, without bitterness and without blame, because the people who built Safeway, who staffed its tills and stocked its shelves and cut ham at its deli counters for 4 decades, built something genuinely good. They built a place that made ordinary errands feel for a little while like something almost worth looking forward to. The workers who trained the next generation on machines they themselves had once found new. The founders who believed, back in 1962, that British families deserved a little more choice and a little more dignity in how they shopped. The customers who never once thought to say goodbye because nobody warned them there would be a last visit. All of them are owed this much, an honest telling of what was built and an honest acknowledgement of what was lost when it disappeared. Somewhere tonight, someone old enough to remember is describing the sound of a self-scan gun, or the taste of bread from a Safeway bakery counter, to a grandchild who will never hear that beep or taste that loaf. The grandchild will not fully understand, but they will sense, in the way the memory is told, that something ordinary and warm and thoroughly British stood on that spot once, and that it is worth remembering even now that the sign above the door has long since changed.